North American Society for Oceanic History was created by maritime scholars who met in 1971 at the University of Maine. They recognized that in North America there was no forum for maritime history or a society devoted to the study and promotion of maritime history. The aim of the original group of organizers was to create a diverse organization based initially on Canadian and American membership, which would gain the interest of others. Now there are members worldwide, and it is this diversity of membership that continues to make NASO a truly unique organization. 2020 marked the first year in recent memory that NASO was unable to meet, and therefore we bring historians, archaeologists, and students who are scheduled to present. Welcome to the North American Society for Oceanic History podcast. I am your host, Sal Mercogliano. The goal of the NASO podcast is to bring you some of the best historians, professionals, and up-and-comers in the field of maritime history. Today we're joined by Dr. John Beeler of the University of Alabama. Dr. Beeler is a renowned historian in 19th century British imperial defense policy. He's been acknowledged for his research and teaching by his colleagues and students. He's a man of great patience, as I can attest to, as he was my dissertation advisor. Welcome, John, to the inaugural NASO podcast.
Thanks, Sal. It's great to be here. It's a nice opportunity to share my work and the current projects and future projects with a larger audience, I hope.
You were scheduled to present down at the NASO conference in Pensacola this past year, which was canceled due to COVID-19, as many of our lives have been tossed upside down. But before we get into that, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of your research. And again, your research is quite extensive. There's no denying the fact that you are a prolific author, particularly in the area of 19th century British naval defense policy. And one of the areas that, in particular, you're working on a book right now, I know, to follow up on your earlier book on British naval policy in the Gladstone-Disraeli era, which we'll talk about. But one of the persons who kind of haunt your past is Sir Alexander Milne. You've done quite a lot of work on him, particularly going through his records and his papers. And I was wondering if you could talk about him, his role, his kind of context in Royal Navy history. Alexander Milne's not a name known by many people. So I was wondering if you can elaborate on him a little bit.
Right, sure, Sal. Part of the reason that Milne flies under the radar is that although he was in the Navy for 60 years, joined as a boy in 1817 when he was 11 years old and was mandatorily retired at age 70 in 1876. During that entire 60 years, he never once heard British guns fired in anger. This period used to be referred to as the Pax Britannica, the British peace. The British are involved in one substantial European war right in the middle of that, the Crimean War in 1854. But Milne, by that point, is a naval administrator, and when he applies for active duty, the First Lord of the Admiralty says, "No, I can't spare you." Basically, he's too valuable as an administrator, so he's chained to his desk during the one opportunity he would have to, participate in what naval officers, the core mission of naval officers. He grows up in a world where patronage dominates. His dad's an admiral. His dad knows a lot of insiders in the naval administrative hierarchy, particularly while the Tories are in power. And Milne's early promotions, his promotion to lieutenant and his promotion to commander, basically are the works of patronage string pulling. They're not based on his own merit, substantial though that is. They're based on who his daddy knows. But when he's promoted to captain in 1839, it's on the basis of his own merit. He's given an acting captain's commission, but by a guy who doesn't know his dad, Milne by that point has demonstrated his professional abilities as a sailor and a navigator, and is also he gets his promotion at Vera Cruz, where the British intervene in 1839. He's also establishing a reputation for diplomacy and tact. He goes on to be flag captain to his dad, another patronage plum, and then ends up as flag captain to one of the guys who is renowned for, fighting battles, Sir Charles Napier. If you're familiar with the British intervention at Acre in 1840, against the forces of the Khedive of Egypt. It's Charlie Napier who is responsible for that bombardment of a shore installation. Napier employs Milne as a flag captain, and then in 1847 writes the First Lord of the Admiralty and says, "Oh, give Milne a knighthood. You know, he's been such a valuable guy for me." And the First Lord of the Admiralty writes him back and says, "Oh, we don't give silly knighthoods. It sounds almost Monty Python-esque. That's a silly reward anyway. We'll bring him into the Admiralty and we'll make him a working lord of the first of the Board of Admiralty." So he goes to the Board of Admiralty in December of 1847 and basically functions as a one-man naval staff. They don't officially have a naval staff there, but whenever anything needs serious research, you know, figure out the logistics of coaling steamships, for instance. How can we do this quickly? And they send Milne around to the private establishments, which, you know, like Cunard, you know, in Liverpool, which have to coal steamships on a regular basis. And he comes back with this report, says, well, this is how the private sector does it, and this is how I'd recommend establishing it at Portsmouth and Plymouth. And the rest of the Board of the Admiralty just basically says, oh, you've done such a thorough job on this that we can safely entrust it to you. That's the reputation he establishes. And that's the reason that come the Crimean War, the First Lord of the Admiralty says, I can't spare you. In fact, he's in charge of the transport department. So he's transporting all the troops out to the Black Sea. He's making sure the arrangements, the logistical arrangements supporting not only the army in the Black Sea, which he does a good job of, by the way. There are a lot of problems with the Crimean, but they're the problems on the army side, not the Navy side. He's responsible for, you know, sending troops out to the Black Sea. He's responsible for the logistics of the support of the fleet in the Baltic. And so he stays at the Admiralty for 12 years as a junior naval lord from 1847 to 1859. Then, you know, goes to sea as the commander-in-chief of the North American West Indies Station on the eve of the American Civil War, and is so valuable there, not least of all for his tact and diplomacy, that he is ordinarily, that's a 3-year commission, and they extend it by a year from 1860 to 1864 because he is one of the point people for Anglo-American relations during the U.S. Civil War, and those relations are pretty tense a lot of the time. They come fairly close to war, and since there are no core British interests at stake, the British don't really want to be involved in a war if they can possibly avoid it. And my screen has gone dark here. He's one of the 2 point people. The other guy is the British ambassador in Washington. In the American Civil War, the British don't really want a war, but if they're pushed into one, and the Americans come pretty close to pushing them into one, for instance, over the Trent affair in late 1861, you know, Milne is good at pouring oil on troubled waters. That's one of his skills. And because he's so good at that, you know, at the end, he's preparing for war should it break out over the Trent affair. If the U.S. doesn't release the so-called Confederate emissaries and doesn't apologize, back down for what they've done, it will be war with Great Britain. I don't think the British are bluffing at all. And so Milne's simultaneously making preparations for war on the one hand, and then doing everything he can possibly do to diffuse crises with the United States over belligerent rights, about the doctrine of continuous voyage, about the American blockade of the South, and so on and so forth. He leaves that position in 1864, becomes First Lord of the Admiralty in 1866, stays in that position for 2 years, then gets the real plum command in the Royal Navy. The Mediterranean station is the most prestigious overseas command. He has that in 1869-70. He's promoted to full admiral. It's a vice admiral's position. He comes home, and it looks like it's the end of his career, more or less, as a naval officer. He may get one of the dockyard commands. He is assigned to a British committee assessing the Alabama claims. I don't need to explain that. I guess most listeners will know. The British allowed the so-called Confederacy to take delivery on a number of warships, the most notorious of which was the CSS Alabama. And the United States brings claims against the British government for the destruction that the Alabama and the Florida and other Confederate commerce raiders wrought on American merchant shipping. You know all about this. It accelerates the flight from the flag that was already taking place. And Milne is appointed to a British commission to study the U.S. claims and respond to them. And so it looks like that's the end of his career, except that naval administration in Britain undergoes a crisis in the early 1870s. And the Liberal government then in power really needs somebody to restore public confidence in naval administration. And so they asked Alexander Milne in 1872, would you consider being first naval lord again? And Milne says, well, if I can render any duty to the service, I should do this sort of thing. So he takes it and he stays in the position for 4 years. And that is when he is formulating that imperial defense policy that you were talking about. He figures the volume of British trade, which goes from each port, the places where there's strategic choke points, for instance, the English Channel, where we need to station cruisers to interdict commerce raiders. And he basically works this out pretty scientifically. And when there's a subsequent Royal Commission at the end of the 1870s, of which he's a member, which is looking at this from the standpoint of the next level up, the government level, they basically adopt the policies that he's come up with while he's first naval lord in the mid-1870s. He's retired in 1876. He serves on commissions and committees after that, but that's the end of his naval career. His last official service is in Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee in 1887. He is the head of a delegation which presents Victoria with a model of a sailing ship of the line, such as was the pointed end of British naval power in 1837, and presents her with a model of the most up-to-date battleship in the Royal Navy as of 1887, just to show how much things have changed technologically in the 50 years she's been Queen of England. Okay, and I've probably gone on too much, so I'll shut up.
That is perfect. It's exactly what we wanted. People are listening to you, not to me. I do want to go back because there's two things that you mentioned I think I find really interesting. Number one, would you consider Alexander Milne almost as like a proto Jackie Fisher? He sounds exactly like that. Before there was a Jackie Fisher, he has that role. And then second, I do want to go back to that issue about the Civil War, because again, you were going to talk about that at the NASO conference. And I think that's a really important thing. I think most people don't realize the international aspect of the American Civil War and the absolute issue at play about British intervention in the Civil War. And it gets a passing review sometimes, but I think there's a lot more to it than goes on. So if you want to talk about the Jackie Fisher comparison first, please.
Okay. Milne's service at the Admiralty encompasses the modernization of the battle fleet, the application of steam power to the battle fleet. That gets underway just before he comes to the Admiralty. And as I said, he's the guy who gets to work out, well, how are we going to coal these damn things? And how much coal will we need? And what does the adoption of steam power mean for the formulation of a defense policy which can protect the colonies, which can protect the home islands from invasion, and critically can protect the sea lines of communication, which are increasingly important? The British become deeply dependent on imported food in the 1860s and the 1870s. And for that, ultimately, the Navy is absolutely critical. But at the same time, got this technological change. When he comes to the Admiralty, steam is just being applied to line of battleships. By the time he leaves at the Admiralty in 1876 for the last time, we've got a proto-battleship of the type you can see on the cover of Imperial Defense there. This is recognizably something along the lines of a modern battleship in terms of its layout. So he is there for this whole process of technological transformation, the incorporation of armor, the incorporation of breech loading rifled cannon, the incorporation of torpedoes, the incorporation of electricity aboard ships. This all happens while he is a naval administrator. But there's something else going on there too. And it is something that he is not the only person to realize, but he's really critical in bringing forward. And that is, back in the day when you had deep sea sailors on sailing vessels, deep sea sailors didn't have any skills which were really transferable to land. And so you didn't have to compete against shore-based facilities for deep water sailors. You only had to compete against the merchant marine. When you go to steam power, though, you've got to have steam engineers. You've got to have stokers. And all of those guys have jobs they could take on land in factories. And so the Navy ends up competing for the skills of these engineering guys, who they have to have. They can look down on them socially, and the executive office certainly do, but you need them anyway. And the Royal Navy is never going to have a pay scale which makes them competitive with factories. So you got to do something. You got to come up with something to entice these guys to join the Navy, to go off and serve for weeks or months at a time in a single sex environment with plenty of food, but not particularly good food. And, you know, you're away from the comforts of home. You're away from the security and the social life that you can enjoy on land. How do you attract these guys? And so Milne in the early 1850s is one of the critical figures in creating what we call the continuous service system. You don't sign up for an individual ship's commission, you sign up for 10 years. We'll get the kids when they're 14 years old. We'll have trained them as apprentices. Then when they're 16, they become ordinary seamen. In a couple of years, they'll become able seamen. They serve their 10 years. They learn about breech loading rifles. They learn about electricity. They eventually learn about torpedoes. They serve their 10 years. Then if they sign up for another 10 years, they get a pension at the end of it. They serve their 20 or 21 years. They get a pension at the end of it. It's not enough to survive off of entirely, but you're in your early 40s. You can go and take a career on land. You've got valuable skills which are transferable to land, and you can collect your pension for the rest of your life. It's the modern trajectory for service, for both for enlisted personnel and for officers, most of whom are retired in their early 40s. Milne is the critical figure in developing that system in the 1850s. So yeah, his reforms are as important as Jackie Fisher's, arguably more important than Jackie Fisher's. They're spread out over a longer period of time because he's at the Admiralty intermittently from the late 1840s to the mid 1870s, whereas Fisher is only first naval lord for 6 years, from 1904 to 1910, and then briefly again at the beginning of the First World War. But here's a crucial difference between the two of them. Milne's reforms are equally valuable. In fact, you could argue more valuable than Jackie Fisher's, but Milne gets along with everybody. He never quarrels. He says in his letters to his brothers, I've never quarreled with a superior or a subordinate officer. It's a little bit of an exaggeration, because if his subordinates don't measure up to his fairly high expectations, he damn well will quarrel with them. But he gets along with virtually everybody, whereas Fisher just, I could use a crude colloquialism, which has to do with urinating. He is that sort of person. He's this deeply divisive, polarizing guy, unscrupulous as all get out. You can look at his career. Basically, he rises through the service not on the basis of who his daddy is, but on the basis of finding service patrons. And then when they've served their purpose for him, he discards them. And he does this again again and again and again. Milne never does anything like that. You were going to say?
No, that definitely differentiates himself from Jackie Fisher.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. And so when Milne leaves the service in 1876, he's universally admired. You don't have a syndicate of discontent like you do with Fisher. You don't have a bunch of retired senior officers saying that unscrupulous little piece of excrement. Milne just doesn't. Milne isn't that sort of personality at all. And so I would make the argument, and I'm a prejudiced person, obviously, when it comes to Milne, the reforms that Milne carries out or at least as important as the reforms that Jackie Fisher carries out, arguably more important. They're really more radical. The step from a pre-dreadnought battleship to a dreadnought battleship is a difference of degree. A step from a wooden steam battleship with smoothbore cannon to something akin to a modern pre-dreadnought battleship is a huge change. Granted, it took place over decades, but it's a much bigger change than the shift from a dreadnought to or a pre-dreadnought to a dreadnought.
Well, I
And
think that
Milne, yeah,
I think that
Milne,
symbolism you talked about with presenting to Queen Victoria it
yeah,
encapsulates
yeah,
that perfectly.
yeah, and when Milne retires in 1876, his departure is basically universally lamented by the service because he is universally respected and admired by the service.
I want to kind of bring you back to the topic that you were going to present at NASO. The paper was entitled Britain, Spain, the United States, and the Cuban Slave Trade During the American Civil War, which I think is really an interesting topic. So I was wondering if you can just broach into that a little bit and discuss it.
Sure. Milne serves as a junior officer, as a commander and a junior captain on the North American West Indies Station in the late 1830s and the very early 1840s. And one of the duties that he is on regularly when he's assigned to the Jamaica Division is anti-slavery patrol. And while he's a junior officer in command of a private vessel, he captures 4 slavers, 3 of them with slaves aboard, the 4th with the equipment characteristic of the trade. By the time he comes back as commander of the North American West Indies Station in 1860s, the dynamic of anti-slavery patrol has changed radically. In the late 1830s and the early 1840s, the British Navy, the Royal Navy was very effective at anti-slavery patrol, but since that point, and particularly in the late 1850s, a lot has changed. First, the Royal Navy has restructured the North American West Indies force to deal with filibusters rather than slaving vessels, and it means they've got bigger ships, more powerful ships, real warships, and they have cut down on the number of small, nimble craft which can chase down slavers. So they're not particularly good at it by this point. The filibusters, the British are deeply concerned of an American occupation of Cuba, annexation of Cuba, and the filibusters seem to be, if you will, the leading edge of American efforts to annex Cuba. And second of all, there's an American court decision in 1858 which basically says we will not seize and prosecute slaving vessels which don't carry any papers on them. And so the Royal Navy concludes, one, if we stop a suspected slaver, they're going to pull out their American papers and we can't stop and search them because the Americans are really, really touchy about the British exercising stop and search. Think back to the War of 1812. And if they are stopped, this is unlikely, by an American warship on anti-slavery patrol, they'll just toss their papers overboard. And they can't be seized if they don't have any papers. And the British conclude there's no point in carrying on anti-slavery patrol under these circumstances. Plus, we're more worried about filibusters anyway. So by the time that Milne assumes command of the North America West Indies Station in 1860, the Royal Navy, the Admiralty, have basically concluded that anti-slavery patrol around Cuba is a fool's errand. There are too many demands on the Navy's ships. There are not enough of them to go around. It's not simply that we have to deal with monitoring the American Civil War. The British intervene in Mexico in late 1861, early 1862. They don't stay there very long. There's a civil war in Venezuela. There's a civil war in Colombia. All of these places require the presence of British warships to protect British subjects and to protect British property. And under these circumstances, anti-slavery patrol, which is already difficult, hamstrung, is way down the list of priorities. And so Milne, the Foreign Office, the British Foreign Office, keeps saying, send vessels, anti-slavery vessels to the coast of Cuba, and the Admiralty keeps saying back, and Milne keeps saying back, there's not any point in doing this until 1862, because in 1862, the British and the Americans finally sign an anti-slavery treaty. One of the big obstacles, obviously, is the presence of the slave power in the southern states, which is going to keep any such treaty from being signed. But once the southern states have seceded, Lincoln's government has very little trouble acceding to British demands for the right to stop and search and seize American vessels suspected of engagement in the nefarious trade. And at the same time, the North hangs a slave captain, a guy named Nathaniel Gordon, the only captain of an American flag slaving vessel ever to be prosecuted and hanged. And that's a really healthy deterrent, because you've got to keep in mind that it's not just the southern states which are pro-slavery. Most of the vessels engaged in the Atlantic slave trade to Cuba, I'm less certain about Brazil, but I suspect it's still true of Brazil too, are American flagged, because as long as there's no slave trade treaty between the United States and Britain, American vessels can sail with impunity with British, past British warships engaged in anti-slavery patrol, because the British warships can't stop, search, and seize them. But now you've got, the southern states are gone, but where are all of those American flag slave vessels sailing from? They're not sailing from Charleston or New Orleans. They're not sailing from Wilmington. They're not sailing from Savannah. They're sailing from New York. They're sailing from Providence. To a lesser extent, they're sailing from Boston. But New York is the slave trading capital for the American Merchant Service. And so it's not just the southern states are implicated in this. All of the eastern seaboard states are implicated in this too. But Lincoln's government, they're determined to stamp out slavery. And so they're going to come down with a heavy hand on those American merchant firms in New York City and those American merchant firms in Providence, and to a lesser extent in Boston, which are engaged in the nefarious trade. And so Milne starts stationing vessels off the coast of Cuba as soon as the slave treaty is in force. In the fall of 1862, he details 4 and then 5 vessels to cruise the coast of Cuba. The British anti-slavery patrol is back in force, and you know what? They don't capture a single slave vessel. And yet, the slave trade implodes. It implodes because of the Anglo-American Treaty. It implodes because Lincoln's government comes down with a heavy hand on the slave traders. It's because they hang Nathaniel Gordon. And it's also because the governor general, the Spanish governor general in Cuba between 1862 and 1866, actually wants to stamp out the slave trade, despite Cuban planters who want more and more slaves. Ironically, the demand for Cuban sugar is going up because the British have adopted free trade, and they're going to buy their sugar from wherever it can be produced the most cheaply, and that's Cuba and Brazil. And so the British adoption of free trade ironically stimulates the demand for slaves in Cuba. But you've got a Cuban governor general who says, be damned to the planters, I'm going to enforce the existing anti-slavery treaties. He says, be damned to the Spanish government, which is, of course, ultimately reaping the financial benefits of growing sugar and selling sugar. And so American activity and the activity of, you could almost call him a rogue governor general in Cuba because he's going against the grain, caused the slave trade to implode. And you might say, okay, so the British didn't make any difference in this at all. Except, of course, they did. Because the British commitment to interdicting the slave trade is exactly the policy that the United States begins to follow in 1862. And had the United States done it 20 or 30 years earlier, had the United States come down with a heavy hand on slave trading activities, and had the United States deployed a meaningful anti-slavery patrol of its own, both on the west coast of Africa and at the destination of the slave traders, particularly Cuba, the slave trade probably would have been wiped out. You know, this is counterfactual speculation, and we're historians and we're not supposed to do that sort of thing. But the slave trade probably would have been wiped out in the wake of the Webster-Ashburton Treaty in 1842, and it should have been wiped out in the wake of the Webster-Ashburton Treaty in 1842. So the British example is the right thing. And ironically, by doing the right thing, they play almost no role in the actual implosion of the slave trade to Cuba.
John, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit now about your research methods and how you go about this, because this is really extensive, obviously, background material you've been able to delve into. So I'm wondering, for both the Millens Papers and this research you're doing on the slave trade, what are your best research methods? What do you use, and where do you go, more importantly?
I should probably preface this by saying that I do a very old-fashioned type of history. If
Nothing
I
wrong
were
with that.
if I were starting graduate school all over again, and I'm quite thankful that I'm not, I'd be a social and cultural historian because that's what I'm really interested in now. But the stuff that I'm doing relating to Milne's professional activities requires going to very traditional archives, the British National Archives. It used to be called the Public Record Office, and old farts still call it the Public Record Office. And Milne's professional papers, which are deposited in the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, in London. There are other subsidiary archives that I work in, but they almost all contain the papers of prominent dead white males. If I'm going to look at the Earl of Darby's papers, the 14th Earl of Darby, for instance, I'm going to go to the Liverpool Public Record Office, which is in the Liverpool Public Library, but I'm looking at the papers of a British nobleman whose title of nobility goes back to the late 15th century. Milne is established Scots gentry himself by this point. You know, he is one of the upper 10,000 in Britain. And in a patriarchal world, it is the guys, the heads of household of the upper 10,000, like Milne, who are coming up with policy and implementing policy, and its policy towards the American Civil War, its policy towards the Civil War in New Grenada, Venezuela, or Colombia, its policy towards Mexico, and its policy towards this stamping out the slave trade. And so the papers, you know, I look at the papers of the elites. And I've been looking at them ever since I was doing my dissertation research back in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And so the methodology is fairly straightforward. I don't have to recover, my wife works on the voices of people who have largely been written out of the historical record. I don't have to do that. I have a superabundance of evidence because Milne kept a great deal of his professional correspondence, because Milne repeatedly kept multiple drafts of memoranda and papers that he was working on. And what you don't find in Milne's personal archive, you can very often find in the National Archives, because he was at the Admiralty, and you only have to go through the Admiralty papers at the National Archives, and you might not find draft after draft after draft of memoranda, but chances are you're going to find the finished product. Does that answer your question?
No, that's great. I mean, I think you're on, if I'm not mistaken, volume 4 of Millens Papers now. I mean, so you do.
This is, I knew about Milne before I actually went to London, because, you know, he's obviously one of the chief figures in naval administration in the 1860s and 1870s. So I knew I had to look at his papers, and I knew that his papers were extensive because the National Maritime Museum had published a guide to the manuscript collections in their archives. But when I got there in 1989, 1990, I discovered how important they were for the period that I was working on, the 1860s and 1870s, and finding out a little bit more about Milne and his service at the Admiralty as a junior naval lord in the 40s and the 50s. He's pretty important for that too. He's pretty important for his membership on the Carnarvon Commission. He's really important if you want to understand Anglo-American relations during the American Civil War. And there is this mass of documentary evidence. So in 1994, I made a proposal to the Navy Records Society of Great Britain. The Navy Records Society was one of many organizations founded during the Victorian era with the aim of publishing manuscript sources, to make them available to a larger audience, to the people who couldn't afford to travel to the archives and who might have trouble deciphering handwriting. The Navy Records Society was founded in 1893 to provide manuscript sources to a larger audience. The larger audience intended in 1893 was naval officers. The guys who founded it, I should say, were naval historians and naval officers, and there was clearly a didactic purpose. That these were supposed to be instructional. And as a consequence, most of the volumes of the Navy Records Society for, oh, heaven's sake, certainly its first 50 years, maybe its first 75 years, were about naval tactics and naval strategy, and they were aimed at educating officers. But just as history in general has broadened in marked fashion, so that we don't do dead white male history alone anymore. In fact, that started to change in the 1920s. We now have Navy Records Society volumes on societal issues, the enlistment of sailors, the establishment of continuous service, much broader. Naval history as a whole has broadened in marked fashion, and this is a good thing. And the aims of the Navy Records Society have broadened likewise. But I'm doing administrative history, not tactics, not strategy, but administrative history is important too. How does the Navy go about modernizing its administration? This is as important as it is modernizing its technology or modernizing its personnel policy. And Milne's papers are a gold mine if you're looking at things like that. They're a gold mine if you're looking at Anglo-American relations. So I made a proposal to the Navy Records Society in 1994. Milne's papers are a gold mine for a period about the Royal Navy, which is really understudied because they don't do a whole lot of fighting. And back in 1994, I envisioned 2 volumes, one volume covering, 1817 to 1864, the end of the American Civil War, and the other volume covering his service as first naval lord. and it morphed and it morphed and it morphed. And first of all, I said, well, how about a volume on 1817 to 1859 and a volume on 1860 to 1864 and a volume on 1864 to its retirement and service on the Carnarvon Commission? And the Navy Records Society very generously said yes. And then I got to transcribing the stuff on the American Civil War. And when I finished transcribing, I had more than 600,000 words. And I said to the Navy Records Society, the general editor of the Navy Records Society, I've got so much material on the American Civil War, I think we could probably do 2 volumes on this one rather than 1 volume. I'm still going to have to cut a lot of stuff. And he and the Publications Committee very generously said yes, so it became 4 volumes. And at that point, they put their feet down and said, don't think you're ever going to get more than 4 volumes. And so that's where matters now stand. The first and second volumes have already appeared. The third volume, the typescript of which was completed a couple of summers ago, has now been approved for publication by the Publications Committee and the Navy Records Society. Probably will be another couple of years before it appears because they've got a lot of manuscripts in the queue, typescripts in the queue. And I'm somewhere along the lines of transcribing stuff for the 4th volume, but that's been on hold for a long time. If the 3rd volume is not going to appear for a couple of years, I needn't be in any hurry about the 4th volume right now. So that's a back burner.
Well, no, let me say that I do think your research on the British in this period is so important, mainly because, again, I tend to study a lot about modern American naval policy, and the overlaps between the two are just amazing. This change in technology, the budget issues, a lot of pertinent information of what you're studying is relevant today. So I hope to see those papers come out. I know I'm looking forward to seeing the new book come out. Just in the time we got left, because we are pushing up against our time, I do want to ask you about advice you'd give to young researchers, people entering the field, heading into graduate school. I know for myself, the reason I came to the University of Alabama was not because of a name, but because of you. And I think personality issues are so important for that. So I'm just interested in what you would give for our young listeners, new graduate students, people who are thinking about entering this field, some advice, some insight that you've had over your years.
The first one is a general piece of advice, and that is to look closely not only at the institution and the prestige of the institution, because I think there's this sort of default setting that if I want to earn a PhD, it's got to be from one of a handful of elite institutions, Yale or Princeton or Harvard or UCal Berkeley or Michigan or Chicago. At least as important in my experience was the reputation and name of the person you're working with, and secondarily, how easily how good are they to get along with? How encouraging are they to what you're doing? Because just as the Royal Navy officer corps was built on a system of clientage and patronage, or patronage and clientage. When Milne joined in 1870, it was a patronage and clientage network based on who your daddy was and who your daddy knew. By the time he retired in 1876, you could say that it was a system of patronage and clientage based on perceived merit. So it had changed dramatically in that way. And ideally, that's how academe works. It's a network of patronage and clientage based on merit, based on the merit of the person who is doing the recommending and based on the perceived merit of the person who's being recommended. I went off to the University of Illinois, which was not one of that handful of elite institutions, a very good one, but not one of that handful of elite institutions. But the guy I was working with, named Walter Arnstein, the late, much lamented Walter Arnstein, he died late last year, knew everybody who was anybody in the field of Victorian history. And Walter Arnstein was wonderful to work with, this nurturing, considerate guy. When I applied to the University of Illinois, he was on the graduate admissions committee, and he typed out a letter on an old-fashioned typewriter, personally to me, saying, let me tell you something about the University of Illinois and the things that we've got which can facilitate graduate study, beginning with the library, but including members of the faculty and things like that. He's that kind of person. And so when I went out on the job market in the early 1990s, I had Walter Arnstein writing on my behalf. And when anybody received a letter from Walter Arnstein, they knew it was the real deal. He knew everybody. A good example, barely, I think, overlapped with you at the University of Alabama, was George Rabel, my now retired but still very active colleague, George Rabel. George Rabel, if you're doing Civil War history, George Rabel is one of those names that everybody knows, one of those names that everybody respects, because George Rabel not only knows everybody and gets along with everybody, he's sort of an Alexander Milne-like figure. Everybody respects him for his accomplishments, and everybody knows that if George Rabel is writing a letter of recommendation and praising a candidate, they're good, because George Rabel's reputation is riding on that. Walter's reputation is riding on that. And I'm never going to be, I work in a much narrower niche than Walter did or George Rabel, a much lower profile niche perhaps than Walter did or George Rabel did. But I hope that I have established the same sort of professional reputation, that if John Beeler is writing a recommendation for you, that it's not recommendation inflation, that Beeler means what he's actually saying. I think that matters for a lot. The other piece of advice I would have to young scholars is, don't do what I did. Don't do old-fashioned elites political and administrative history, because that started to go out of fashion with the arrival of the Annales School in the 1920s. And with my perspective, looking back, the Annalists were right. It's the lives of everyday people are just as valuable, are just as important a target of historical inquiry as dead white males. And then we've had successive waves which are broadening the questions that we ask of the past, which are broadening the fields of scholarly inquiry in ways that the people who founded the historical discipline back in the mid and late 19th century never would have dreamed of. And so if you're going in the direction of social history, if you're going in the direction of cultural history, if you're going in the direction of economic history, your chances are probably going to be better on the job market than people like me. I was very lucky. The University of Alabama actually hired a naval historian, and maybe that's because the University of Alabama was a little bit old-fashioned in the early 1990s when I got a job there. But they actually hired a naval historian. I've been applying for modern British history jobs, and I was up against 75 or 100 or more candidates, and none of those jobs gave me the time of day. When the University of Alabama hired a naval historian, I had to draft a whole new letter of application because I was touting my credentials as a modern British historian rather than my credentials as a naval historian. Because I realized that if I were counting my credentials as a naval historian, I was probably tying an anchor to myself and jumping in the deep end. I don't want to make this sound, I don't want to discourage people from pursuing naval history or maritime history. What I would say is, look at the lives of ordinary sailors. Look at the way that the sea has influenced entire societies and entire states. It's a direction very much in keeping with the aims of NASO. You know, how have the oceans affected the development of human civilization? How have the oceans, how has the sea affected the development of individual states? And that includes the United States. So think broadly, think in cultural terms, think in social terms, think in economic terms, and you're probably going to be better off when you enter the job market than I was back in the early 1990s when I was um, trying to sell myself as a guy who basically did old-fashioned dead white male history, trying to sell myself as something other than that. And anybody who looked at my research could say, yeah, he's just lying.
Well, John, that was a great answer to it, and I appreciate it. And I know on behalf of many advisees you've had over the years, we appreciate your advice that we've had. And I think
you're doing a broader history. You're dealing with the economic importance of the sea in wartime, to be sure, but also in peacetime. And remember, peacetime is the normative state of navies. It's the British have been at peace for most of the past 200 years. The United States officially has been at peace for the past 200 years, but we still need navies.
You're exactly right. And I just want to take a moment and thank you for being with us on our inaugural podcast. I particularly want to thank your wife, Dr. Sharni Green, for a little bit of technical assistance at the beginning. We appreciate it. John and Sharni. John and Sharni are joining us from their home today in beautiful Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Again, I want to officially thank Dr. Beeler for joining us on this inaugural podcast. If you liked our podcast, be sure to click on the link on YouTube. Give it 5 stars on your podcast provider. We'll have links to Dr. John Beeler's page from the University of Alabama and his book so that you can follow Dr. Beeler and look at some of the works that we referenced here during this podcast. Please subscribe to our channel to receive updates as we continue to interview maritime historians. You can follow us on Facebook, on Twitter at NASO_history. The best way to follow NASO is to become a member as you receive our newsletter, our quarterly journal, Northern Mariner. We publish jointly with the Canadian Nautical Research Society. You can come join us at our yearly conference scheduled to be this following year, 2021, down in Pensacola, Florida. And you can go to www.naso.org, click on membership to join. Until our next talk, keep sailing. Thank you.